Have you ever felt a whisper from the past? We're so glad you're here to listen to one now. You're about to hear the biological cost of Apollo missions, the radiation NASA downplayed, one of 5 captivating echoes from Histogate Media's collection, The Secret History of Science, Volume 1. To hear all the whispers, we've placed a link to the complete volume in the description. For now, listen closely.
The biological cost of Apollo missions, the radiation NASA downplayed. Chapter 1. The Invisible Ocean. Before we sent men, we sent machines. On January 31st, 1958, a Jupiter C rocket tore through the Florida sky, pushing America's first satellite, Explorer 1, into the black. Tucked inside was a simple Geiger counter, the work of a physicist from Iowa named Dr. James Van Allen. What it sent back was not data, but a riddle. At certain altitudes, it registered expected radiation. At others, it went silent. 0. The team feared an equipment failure. The truth, confirmed by a later mission, was far more shocking. The silence wasn't absence, it was overload. The instrument was so saturated with charged particles that its sensors simply shut down. Humanity had just dipped a finger into the cosmos and discovered it was not a serene vacuum, but a violent, invisible ocean. Van Allen had discovered a fundamental feature of our planet, a natural barrier of immense power, now known as the Van Allen radiation belts, 2 furious rings of trapped radiation girdling the Earth, held fast by the planet's magnetic field. To reach the moon, you had to fly straight through them. This discovery confronted the program's architects, men like Werner von Braun at Marshall and Robert Gilruth in Houston, with a problem that could not be solved with a slide rule. It was biological. Physicists huddled over calculations, grappling with a force of nature they could neither predict nor stop. The thin sanctuary of the aluminum and steel Apollo capsule offered little defense, yet the political imperative was absolute. On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy had stood before Congress and reset the nation's clock. The goal was to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth, before this decade is out. Safety was mentioned, but the deadline was the point. In the Cold War, space was the ultimate theater of operations. The pressure was immense, creating a culture where acknowledging an insurmountable risk was the same as admitting defeat. The radiation problem could not be a showstopper. Therefore, it had to be managed, not just technically, but informationally. NASA's engineers reasoned that a fast trajectory could punch through the Van Allen belts in under an hour, keeping the dose high but survivable. But the belts were only the violent shoreline. Beyond Earth's magnetic shield lay deeper, more treacherous waters. The first threat was a constant rain of galactic cosmic rays, the atomic nuclei of shattered stars traveling at nearly the speed of light. Against these atomic-scale bullets, the only defense was to be quick. The second, and far more terrifying, was the solar particle event, a solar flare. If galactic cosmic rays were a steady rain, a solar particle event was a cosmic hurricane. A major flare could erupt from the sun with almost no warning, flooding the void with a lethal torrent of protons. An astronaut on a spacewalk would die in minutes. Even inside the command module, a major event could flood the cabin with enough radiation to cause catastrophic illness, the rapid breakdown of the central nervous system, uncontrollable sickness, and a slow, agonizing death. This was the truth that was deliberately minimized. NASA's public story was one of manageable risk. They spoke of the quiet sun, timing missions for the solar minimum, a period of reduced activity. This was true, but it was a forecast, not a guarantee. Every word was chosen to build a narrative of confidence. The reality, known to every radiation biologist in the program, was a game of cosmic Russian roulette, where the trigger was pulled by a star 93 million miles away. This gamble was physically built into the mission architecture. Early flights used a free return trajectory, a celestial slingshot that would loop the spacecraft around the Moon and back to Earth even if the main engine died. It was a brilliant solution to one problem, but it created an inescapable trap for another. Once committed, a crew could not turn back. If a major solar storm erupted, they would have no choice but to ride it out for days, absorbing the storm's fury. The known risk of engine failure was deemed greater than the unpredictable, but far more lethal risk of the sun. It was a trade-off made in silence, a crucial detail omitted from the heroic public narrative. The world was told NASA had built a chariot to the Moon. In truth, it was a bottle thrown into a tempest, its fate resting entirely on the hope that the weather would hold. Chapter 2: Engineering the Narrative. The most powerful engine in the Apollo program wasn't bolted to the base of the Saturn V, it was the story. This story of American mastery of infallible machines and unflappable men was a manufactured resource, engineered with the same precision as a guidance computer to protect the mission's astronomical budget and its fragile political mandate. Its chief architect was Julian Scheer, NASA's head of public affairs, a former journalist with a keen understanding that Apollo was not just a scientific endeavor, but a real-time performance for a global audience. The official policy he championed was one of maximum disclosure, governed by a critical caveat: all information must be consistent with the national interest. During the Cold War, the national interest was an ironclad justification for control. It meant victory, and victory required a narrative of absolute confidence. This principle transformed public relations from a communications desk into a strategic arm of the mission, a machine for building and maintaining national will. The story of Apollo had to be one of control, not of chance. It needed to project an image of exhaustive preparation, erasing the margins of error and downplaying the vast, terrifying unknowns. The primary technique was not deception, but a sophisticated and systemic omission, a masterpiece of information compartmentalization. The heroic narrative was for public consumption. The unsettling uncertainties were confined to the grey bureaucratic bindings of internal technical reports, effectively buried by their complexity and jargon. NASA's press kits were the primary tool of this craft. Weighing several pounds, they were dense with specifications and minute-by-minute flight plans, a deliberate data dump designed to overwhelm and impress. Readers could find detailed schematics of the F-1 engines and the tensile strength of the lunar module's legs. Then, in a small subsection, the subject of radiation was acknowledged and immediately neutralized. The command module, reporters were assured, provided adequate shielding. A system called the Solar Particle Alert Network, or SPAN, a small network of solar observatories, was in place to provide warning of any hazardous solar activity. What was deliberately omitted was the terrifying context. The public was not told that adequate shielding would be functionally useless against a major solar storm. They were not told that SPAN was a cruel misnomer. A major flare's light would reach Earth in 8 minutes, but its slower-moving cloud of lethal protons could arrive in as little as half an hour. The warning, therefore, was a 20-minute heads-up for a catastrophe already in progress. It offered no time to take cover, no chance to abort. It was an obituary service, not an alarm bell, a system designed only to report a disaster, not to prevent it. The astronauts were the living embodiment of this narrative. Through an exclusive contract with Life magazine, their lives were curated into an inspiring portrait of wholesome, all-American heroism. Chosen for their preternatural calm as military test pilots, they were rigorously conditioned to be the public face of the program's confidence. In countless interviews, amplified by a media eager to tell a story of national greatness, they spoke in the clipped, professional language of men who had anticipated every contingency. Their silence on the true radiation threat was not born of ignorance, but immense discipline. They were officers in a high-stakes war, and their duty was to project absolute certainty, reassuring Congress and the nation that its colossal investment was safe. The result was a profound chasm between public perception and private reality. The heat shield on the command module was an extraordinary piece of engineering. designed to protect the crew from the searing heat of re-entry. The story Julian Scheer built was its own kind of heat shield, just as critical and as carefully constructed, designed to protect the mission itself from the incinerating power of the truth. Chapter 3: Streaks in the Dark. 250,000 miles from home, in the perfect silent black between worlds, the darkness inside an astronaut's head was not empty. The Apollo command module was a cramped, humming hive of technology, a tiny bubble of terrestrial life adrift in an ocean of lethal vacuum. In this profound isolation, with the Earth a shrinking blue marble in a small window, the human mind was the most sensitive instrument of all. The phenomenon began on Apollo 11. As Buzz Aldrin, exhausted after the first moonwalk in human history, tried to sleep in the near-total darkness of the cabin, he saw it. A silent, instantaneous pinpoint of white light, a flash that existed only behind his closed eyelids. On the ground, it was logged as a curiosity, perhaps a product of stress or a neurological quirk. But it was not an anomaly. It was a warning. On subsequent missions, the reports became routine, a strange side effect of deep space travel. The crew of Apollo 12 saw them. The crew of Apollo 13, even amidst their catastrophic emergency, reported the eerie flashes. By Apollo 14, the phenomenon was so undeniable that the crew was specifically tasked with documenting it, wearing blindfolds during rest periods and noting the frequency, shape, and direction of the flashes. In their technical debriefings, they described them with the unnerving precision of trained observers: long, bright streaks, sudden starbursts, and faint double flashes that erupted in their visual field without a source. This wasn't fatigue. This was physics. The invisible ocean was leaving a trail of biological wreckage. For the scientists at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, the conclusion was immediate and chilling. The flashes were almost certainly a phenomenon caused when a charged particle travels faster than the speed of light in a given medium. In this case, the vitreous humor of the astronaut's eyeball. They were the direct result of galactic cosmic rays, heavy atomic nuclei, remnants of ancient supernovae, traveling at nearly the speed of light. A single, high-energy particle, most likely an iron nucleus, was tearing through the spacecraft's hull, the astronaut's skull and their living tissue, striking the retina or visual cortex with enough force to trigger a neuron. Each silent flash was the footprint of a subatomic bullet passing through a human brain. Here, the narrative architects who had so skillfully managed the public story faced their most subtle challenge. They could not deny the existence of the light flashes. They were officially logged phenomena discussed in scientific papers. Instead, they neutralized them through framing. The strategy was to contain the truth by smothering its terrifying implications. Publicly, the flashes were presented as a curious anomaly, an interesting side effect of space travel, a novel data point for physicists, not a symptom of ongoing cellular assault for biologists. It was an interesting story about physics that cleverly disguised a terrifying story about biology. What was silenced was the profound and unanswerable question: what happens when you repeatedly fire atomic-scale particles through the human brain? The potential for cumulative neurological damage, for retinal scarring, for the slow onset of cataracts or cancer was a terrifying unknown. Admitting that the universe was actively physically damaging its heroes in a way that no technology could prevent was a narrative killer. The transcripts of the astronaut debriefings capture an eerie reality entirely absent from the public record. In their clipped, professional voices, the most capable pilots on Earth described the passive, helpless experience of having their own bodies turned into particle detectors. The danger wasn't a faulty gauge outside the cockpit. It was inside their own heads. The universe wasn't just a place they were visiting. It was a force that was leaving its signature, not in a logbook, but in their very biology. Chapter 4: The Storm That Missed. Between the triumphant splashdown of Apollo 16 in April 1972 and the final lunar voyage of Apollo 17 that December, a sense of masterful routine had settled over the program. The moon was empty, but on Earth, Gene Cernan's crew ran their final simulations for the grand finale. This was the victory lap. The engineering challenges had been met, the operational procedures perfected. The mission felt, for the first time, almost repeatable. In this quiet interlude, while the nation looked ahead to the last mission, the universe ran the experiment NASA had spent a decade praying to avoid. The antagonist was a festering wound of magnetic energy on the face of the Sun, designated McMath Region 11,976. On August 2nd, after days of unusual activity, it erupted. Over the next week, it unleashed a fusillade of the most violent solar flares ever recorded, hurling billion-ton clouds of energized protons directly through the Earth-Moon system at speeds exceeding 5 million miles per hour. The resulting geomagnetic storm was so powerful that it caused widespread electrical blackouts across North America, and, in a bizarre display of its reach, induced powerful electrical currents in the long metal casings of U.S. naval sea mines in the waters off Haiphong, North Vietnam, causing dozens to detonate spontaneously. It was a clear terrestrial demonstration of the storm's unimaginable power, a force that could reach across 93 million miles of space and touch the machinery of war. In the quiet, air-conditioned rooms of the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, a ghost mission was flown. As the real-time data from the storm poured in from satellites and solar observatories, scientists and radiation health officers fed it into their computers, modeling what would have happened to an Apollo crew caught in its path. The numbers that scrolled onto the screens were not theoretical. They were an autopsy report for a crew that had never flown. The post-event analysis, later published in the dry clinical prose of NASA, Technical Note D7080, was terrifyingly clear. Inside the thin sanctuary of the command module, the crew would have absorbed a dose approaching 400 rem. This is a number with a stark biological meaning. It is the median lethal dose, or LD50, the statistical point at which a human has a 50% chance of dying within 60 days. Even with the best medical care, the cause would be acute radiation sickness, uncontrollable vomiting, followed by the catastrophic failure of their blood-forming tissues in the bone marrow, triggering a systemic collapse of the immune system and uncontrollable internal bleeding. For an astronaut on a moonwalk, wearing only the thin layers of their spacesuit, the outcome was simpler. The dose would have been unsurvivable. Death from central nervous system damage would not have been swift, but it would have been absolute. This was the bullet NASA had dodged. As this cosmic hurricane raged, the Apollo 17 crew was on the ground, blissfully unaware as they trained for the mission that would launch just 4 months later. The program's greatest unacknowledged fear was not a remote probability. It was a documented event that had occurred in the precise 110-day window between the last 2 flights. The success of the entire Apollo program, the analysis revealed, had been contingent less on engineering genius than on a profoundly lucky roll of the cosmic dice. The survival of its crews had been a matter of scheduling. This terrifying near-miss was never integrated into the grand public narrative. There was no press conference explaining how close the nation had come to an unimaginable disaster in space. The silence surrounding the August 1972 event was the final critical act of the narrative engineering described in Chapter 2. By containing the data, NASA preserved the story of total mastery over the elements. The public saw a chariot of the gods. The storm proved it was a lottery ticket. And with no one watching, the universe had just drawn a losing number. Chapter 5. The Body's Ledger. For decades after the last command module splashed down, the bill for Apollo seemed paid in full. The ticker tape was swept away, the parades ended, and the 24 men who had journeyed to the moon re-assimilated into terrestrial life as living monuments. Their health was monitored by NASA, but the primary concern of the Apollo era, acute radiation sickness from a massive solar flare, had been averted. The immediate dangers had been survived. The biological ledger of their journey appeared closed. It was not. It was merely written in invisible ink, a debt that would not come due for half a century. The Ghost in the Machine appeared in 2016. A study led by Dr. Michael Delp, a specialist in vascular physiology, was published in the peer-reviewed journal Scientific Reports. Its goal was to open a file that had been sealed by time, the long-term mortality of the Apollo astronauts. Delp's team compared this unique cohort against two carefully selected control groups, astronauts who had never flown and those who had only experienced low Earth orbit, a realm still safely nestled inside the planet's protective magnetic field. The results were a statistical thunderclap. The data revealed a chilling pattern. 43% of the deceased lunar astronauts had died from cardiovascular disease. For the other groups, that number hovered around 10%. The men who had traveled into deep space were dying from heart attacks and strokes at a rate 4 to 5 times higher than their colleagues who had stayed behind. Here was the delayed clinical echo of the risk NASA had so carefully minimized. Delp's team proposed a direct link to the unique radiation environment of deep space. The flashes the astronauts saw in the dark were the calling cards of heavy ions from galactic cosmic rays striking their nervous system. Delp's study suggested those same particles had also been silently savaging their vascular system, causing chronic, low-level inflammation of the endothelium, the delicate, single-cell thick lining of their blood vessels. It was not a sudden poisoning like that from a solar flare. It was a slow, systemic scarring, a lifetime of microscopic damage that ultimately led to arterial blockages and catastrophic cardiovascular failure. But historical and scientific integrity demands a pause. The study's most glaring and unavoidable limitation was its punishingly small sample size. Of the 24 men who had flown to the moon, only 7 had passed away at the time of the study's publication. The shocking 43% figure represented the deaths of just 3 individuals: Neil Armstrong, James Irwin, and Ronald Evans. With such small numbers, the possibility of random chance or other confounding lifestyle factors could not be dismissed. The study presented a powerful correlation, not definitive causation. Yet it remains the first clinical evidence suggesting that deep space travel carries a unique, long-tail, and potentially lethal cost. It powerfully reframed the original silence of the Apollo program. The focus had always been on the acute, immediate danger of a solar flare, a risk that could be sold as a survivable gamble. What was never part of the public conversation was the possibility of an insidious chronic threat, a cellular-level toll that would reveal itself only in the obituaries written decades later. Whether this was a deliberate concealment or a genuine failure of imagination is debatable. But the body, it turned out, kept a more honest ledger than the press releases, and its final, unsettling accounting was only just beginning to come into focus. Chapter 6. The Martian Shadow. The ambition did not die with Apollo. It was simply waiting. Today it wears the name of Mars, but the path to the red planet is haunted by the ghosts of the moon. The new challenges are not merely an amplification of those faced in the 1960s. They represent a fundamental transformation of the problem. An Apollo mission was an 8-day sprint across a known gap, a daring dash through the void designed to minimize exposure time. A mission to Mars is a 3-year marathon, a journey where the finish line is not a few days away, but hundreds of millions of miles. The unforgiving math of radiation exposure has changed, and with it, the entire calculus of survival. The central, enduring ghost is the one Apollo could only outrun: galactic cosmic rays. For a crew journeying to Mars, galactic cosmic rays are not a storm to be weathered, but an atmosphere to be breathed for years. The constant penetrating flux of high-energy particles is a certainty, not a probability. There is no quiet sun to hope for, no brief window of safety. The exposure is cumulative, relentless, and unavoidable. And the brutal truth, as NASA's contemporary radiation health officers now state in unvarnished technical briefings, is that there is still no viable shielding solution. In a cruel paradox of physics, simply thickening the aluminum walls of a spacecraft can make the problem worse. When a heavy galactic cosmic ray particle strikes an aluminum atom, it triggers a cascade of secondary radiation, a spray of neutrons and other particles inside the habitat, potentially creating a more dangerous internal environment than a thinner hull would have. This is the long shadow of Apollo's legacy. The data, once minimized for public consumption, has become the most critical and alarming dataset we possess, for planning humanity's next leap. The ghost of the light flashes, once dismissed as a curiosity, is now understood as hard proof of neural pathway penetration, raising concerns about long-term cognitive and central nervous system degradation. The ghost of the cardiovascular study, while statistically limited, serves as a stark warning of long-term systemic damage, a primary data point in modeling chronic health risks. The near miss of the August 1972 solar storm is no longer a footnote. It is a foundational data point in mission risk assessment, a constant reminder that the sun can turn from a source of life to a harbinger of death without warning. The veil of uncertainty, so politically convenient in the 1960s, has become the primary medical and engineering obstacle of the 21st century. NASA operates under a strict career radiation limit for its astronauts, designed to keep their lifetime risk of fatal cancer below a 3% increase. By every current model, a mission to Mars shatters that limit, potentially exposing the crew to a dose equivalent to a full-body computed tomography scan every 5 to 6 days for 3 years. This forces an ethical confrontation that the Apollo era managed to avoid. To go to Mars, NASA must either wait for a revolution in high-speed propulsion to drastically shorten the exposure time, or it must formally ask astronauts to accept a known, high probability of developing a fatal illness years after their return. A risk that cannot be minimized, only disclosed. The triumphant public memory of Apollo suggests that the dangers of deep space are solvable because we have solved them before. But the technical reality, laid bare in the very data that was once suppressed, is that the most profound danger was never solved at all. It was survived. The blueprints for humanity's next giant leap are haunted by the footnotes of the last one, and the road to Mars is paved with the truths that were buried on the way to the Moon. Chapter 7. An Acceptable Gamble. The history of the Apollo program is written in two distinct inks. One is the bold, indelible script of triumph, of footprints in moon dust and a blue marble seen from afar. It is the story of a nation's will made manifest technological genius and the profound courage of the men who rode fire into the sky. The other is a fainter text, written in the margins of technical reports, in dosimetry logs, and in the slow, silent work of the body's ledger. To look back at the decisions made in the 1960s is to ask a question that cuts to the core of any great human endeavor. When a nation's destiny is at stake, what is the line between leadership and deceit? To view the minimization of the radiation risk as a simple cover-up is to ignore the crushing gravity of the historical moment. The United States was on a wartime footing, engaged in a Cold War where technological supremacy was synonymous with survival. The space race was not a gentleman's contest. It was a proxy war fought in the vacuum, and President Kennedy's deadline was its defining battle. From this perspective, championed by historians of policy and Cold War strategy, the management of information by NASA was an act of necessary leadership. Full, unvarnished disclosure of the solar storm gamble or the unknown biological cost of cosmic rays could have crippled public morale, jeopardized congressional funding, and handed the Soviet Union a devastating propaganda victory. The narrative of mastery was not just good public relations. It was a strategic imperative, a unifying force required to mobilize a nation to achieve the impossible. Fear, in this calculus, was the enemy of progress. Yet a different and more troubling perspective emerges from the lens of bioethics and informed consent. This view argues that the very nature of the risk was fundamentally altered by the way it was communicated. The astronauts, military men accustomed to danger, undoubtedly understood and accepted the immediate perils of equipment failure. But did they, or their families, or the public who bore the cost, truly consent to the long-term, uncertain cellular lottery of deep space radiation? When the potential for chronic illness decades later is deliberately downplayed, the fine print of the contract is obscured. The ethical failure, from this standpoint, lies not in taking the risk, but in failing to be fully transparent about its murky, insidious nature. The ends, however glorious, cannot entirely sanctify the means if the means involve a subtle betrayal of trust with the very people taking the ultimate gamble. There is no simple verdict here. The architects of Apollo were not malicious men. They were patriots and visionaries working under extraordinary pressure, making a calculated bet that the mission's success would justify its hidden costs. In the eyes of history, they won that bet. But Apollo left behind a dual inheritance. There is the brilliant public legacy of exploration, a testament to what humanity can achieve when unified by a singular, audacious purpose. And there is a quieter, more complex inheritance, a cautionary tale about the ethics of risk, the seductive power of a flawless narrative, and the long, slow work of the body's ledger. The glory was real, but so was the veil. The enduring legacy of Apollo is not the footprint, but the star-pricked veil itself, the knowledge that behind every giant leap lies a gamble. And the question it leaves for any future voyage is not if we can go, but what we are willing to hide from ourselves to get there.
The whisper fades, but its echo remains. You've just heard The Biological Cost of Apollo Missions, the radiation NASA downplayed, one of 5 compelling accounts from The Secret History of Science, Volume 1. The full collection allows you to hear the other whispers, including The Tesla Enigma, unveiling the hidden legacy of a genius, The Tobacco Conspiracy, the truth the industry silenced, A Poison for Progress, the story of leaded gasoline, and An Animal Intelligence, a scientific silencing. Each story speaks a forgotten truth from our scientific past. If you'd like to own this recording ad-free alongside the other 4, please find the link to the complete volume in the description. We hope you'll join us for Volume 2. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss a single story. Thank you for tuning in.